Right, well, I'm very pleased to see how many people have decided they'd like to find out about this very little known pioneer, Percy Ludgate. And the talk I'll give you is based largely on a paper that a group of us published really very recently in the Annals of the History of Computing. And I'll stress the word group. What I'll talk about today is very much the work with which I've been associated, work that I found myself dragged into a couple of years ago, so to speak. So, Percy Ludgate, 1883 to 1922, clearly somebody involved early on in the history of computing. I found out about Percy Ludgate by accident when, shortly after coming back from the States to Newcastle, I had the duty of giving an inaugural lecture. And in an inaugural lecture, you have the challenge of saying something that might be interest to the general public and won't embarrass your new colleagues. I was looking to say this back in about 1970. I was therefore talking to an audience, many of whom would not even know what computer programming was about. And I decided to start historically, so to speak, and try and find something interesting to my new colleagues about Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage. And in so doing, I stumbled across Percy Edwin Ludgate. One of my starting points was the Science Museum catalogue of 1926. And there I came across the name Ludgate, which was completely unknown to me, and the fact that Ludgate had designed a difference engine. Difference engines I associated with Charles Babbage. I certainly didn't know about a Percy Ludgate designing one. I'd known that there were several others. At this stage, I should explain that though I was interested in the history of computing, this was purely as a spectator. I had not done any investigation at all myself before. That led me, that 1926 catalogue led me to a much earlier wonderful catalogue from an exhibition held in 1914 in Edinburgh, where I found that Percy Ludgate had a whole chapter entitled Automatic Calculating Machines, which was largely about the work of Charles Babbage. But what was startling was the final paragraph in this chapter, which casually said, "I have myself designed an analytical machine." When I saw that, you could well imagine that I was absolutely startled. I'd known of Charles Babbage's work, but then as far as I was concerned then, there was almost a complete blank until close to World War II. And I didn't know very much about that either then. That last paragraph gave a reference to the scientific proceedings of the Royal Dublin Society. If I remember correctly, that was something that I found we had in the Newcastle University Library. If not, wherever I got it, that was pretty easy to get hold of. And that's what I found, a 1909 paper by Percy Ludgate entitled On a Proposed Analytical Machine. What I found was the copy in the journal, in the set of bound together journals for 1909. But in 1909, it was clear that the individual articles were also published separately and sold separately. And I was amused to find recently that in 1909, those preprints cost sixpence. Now it would appear to cost you 1,000 quid to buy a copy of that particular preprint. I believe that the University Trinity in Dublin does have a original preprint. So that's the opening page of the paper, and it, as it says there in the first line, it's describing the work of about 6 years duration by Percy Ludgate. He puts there, of designing machinery capable of performing calculations, however intricate or laborious, without the immediate guidance of the human intellect. A nice way of saying, I wanted to design a programmable computer. I'm certainly not going to read that out, but that's the entirety of the next paragraph of the paper. And the important things it says there, and I believe this completely, is that his work, Ludgate's work, was not based on Babbage. He only learnt about Babbage in the very late stages, possibly when he first submitted his paper. The paper, as published, contains information about Babbage's work, but the differences between Ludgate's design for an analytical machine, Babbage's term, his term, analytical engine, Babbage's term, or program-controlled mechanical computer, to use a more modern terminology, that the differences between Ludgate and Babbage's machines are so great that I am sure the work was done independently. The three main components described in Ludgate's machine concerned the store, the arithmetic unit, as we would call it, and the sequence control mechanism, the program, the means by which the machine was programmed. And all three of those, as far as I'm concerned, in my view, show considerable ingenuity and originality. That is really, I think, quite startling. The machine was to have to record decimal numbers, and the way it would represent these numbers was not by means of little rotating gear wheels, as with Babbage, but with little slides, which the extent to which they stuck out of the holder, the shuttle holding them, indicated the value. Even more startlingly, the machine didn't really use addition as its most basic operation, but rather multiplication. And it had a scheme which the reviewer of Ludgate's paper described as Irish logarithms. Ludgate didn't know them as that, but his reviewer described it that way. And I'll explain those in a moment. And what the machine had as really, in some sense, its most basic operation was that of multiplying all the digits of the multiplicand by a single digit at a time of the multiplier, and doing that by additive linear motion. And that's the one link, if you like, to the notion of a slide rule. The slide rule, of course, is an analog machine or device rather than a digital one. So Ludgate introduced this brand new concept that is now known as Irish logarithms. And if you look down the bottom there, the examples, he had come up with a set of logarithms, indexes, right, which you see there, that the index for the decimal number 1 is 0, for the decimal number 2 is 1, and so on. And down below that in boldface, you can see that by adding the indexes of 3 and 5 together, you get the index corresponding to the number 15, i.e. 3 times 5. Interesting. As that notion, those sorts of indexes were in fact invented in a couple of places at about that time, but quite differently to Ludgate. Our guess is that he found his set of index numbers by trial and error. Those are the tables in his paper. Those are not very legible. So let me, I show you here.
Hi.
Sorry? Okay. Take the table on the left. I have circled those values 3 and 5 and show the little square boxes around them, the index, the logarithm, if you like, of those numbers, 7 and 23. Go across the right-hand table and you will find the index 30, which is the sum of 7 and 23, corresponds to the partial product 15. You can check it painfully if you like, column by column, but what you've got there is essentially a complete multiplication table. What is perhaps surprising is looking at that first table there, there's also a column of ordinal numbers. Those are in fact the sequence number of the indexes when sorted in numeric order. There is a mechanical reason for that, which Ludgate doesn't explain, but we're pretty sure we understand. The programming mechanism. In many ways, the best way of describing the programming mechanism is to describe it as the obvious next improvement on what Babbage had done. Babbage had this rather strange scheme of Jacquard cards, essentially the equivalent of a roll of rather wide paper tape, or rather he had several such rolls of cards, and he didn't have what we would now regard as the obvious notion of a sequence of instructions, each of which specified both the operation to be performed and the operands on which to perform it. That's exactly what Ludgate had got, very simply on a single tape, and as a result, since he agreed with Babbage, so to speak, on the fundamental importance of conditional branching, had a much simpler scheme for doing conditional branching than Babbage ever described. But Ludgate went further than that. He thought about subroutines and had built-in subroutines represented by cylinders. And he talked about the system of cylinders may be indefinitely extended. So in 1970, I'd found this paper. I got excited by it. I started investigating. I, at this stage, had no experience of historical investigations, no experience of doing genealogy either, for that matter. I started trying to find out more about Ludgate and his family. It was thanks to the Royal Dublin Society secretary, who called all the Ludgates in the telephone directory, that we found a relative, Percy Ludgate's niece. She provided me with a photograph, reminiscences, and a link to one other friend of Ludgate, but there was nobody else she could point me to. There were no other relatives to point me to. I found out a little bit about Ludgate, including the review of his paper. And that was about all I found, really. And that took quite a lot of effort, I tell you. Ludgate had said that he had made a complete set of detailed descriptive drawings of the machine, but those drawings or manuscripts had vanished. There were just 2 publications as a result of that. One in the British Computer Society Journal, and then another one a few years later, which didn't provide any new information about Ludgate, but rather discussed his work and contrasting it with 2 other people who followed Babbage and preceded the invention of the modern computer. That was for an invited talk at MIT. Those 2 papers, I think it's fair to say, led to many accounts of the history of computing, starting to include at least brief comments about Ludgate. But essentially nothing further was found from 1971 until just a few years ago. The hunt resumed, and it wasn't resumed by me. It was resumed by Brian Coughlin, who is at Trinity College Dublin, where they have a wonderful collection, computer science collection of machines and documents. He is curator of it, and he essentially asked those 2 questions. Is there any chance that Ludgate's drawings and documents still exist and can be found? Are any relatives excuse me. What's worse, that was a no caller ID call, almost certainly trying to sell me something. I should put my phone on silent. Where was I? Oh, yeah. So Brian had started us up, had gathered a little group around him, and I somehow found myself enmeshed in that work. The investigation that we have done has been described in the IEEE Annals, and a second paper concerning itself more with Ludgate's life is going to appear shortly in the proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy. That's the front of our annals paper. That gives me a chance to tell you who all was involved. Brian was the incredibly industrious leader of our group. Initially my main role was answering, or rather failing to answer, all sorts of questions that the others were asking me. I think it'd be fair to say that just about all that I remembered of my 1971 investigation was down on paper already, and I wasn't able to add very much to that. Paul Hockey is a very excellent genealogist. We were joined later, a little bit later, by a genealogist from the States, and David McQuillan did some very interesting work early work on trying to understand Ludgate's machine from what he'd written about it. Radio Reagan did further investigations of Ludgate's work. That, we were told a few weeks ago, was going to be the front page of our paper in the Royal Irish Academy. There is a date there claiming boldly that it was published on the 17th of August. That, I'm afraid, is not the case. There's been some more minor editorial work by the typesetters, I guess one would describe them as. It should appear, I think, within the next few weeks. So, for those of you who don't know and can't guess what Babbage's analytical engine looked like, please get yourself a copy of that wonderful book by Sidney Padua, The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage. There is more research about Babbage and Babbage's engine there than you would believe possible. And also these wonderful drawings. And that is almost a drawing from that book. We couldn't, in fact, get an answer from the publisher as to whether we could use that drawing. So Sidney Padua very, very kindly produced that version for us. It had the advantage of being a slight correction of the one in a book as well. So Babbage machine, 1834, really massive, with a mill, arithmetic unit in other words, a store, operated by means of punched cards. You see a string of them down at the bottom there, and that's the first machine. The Ludgate's is the one after that. Ludgate's machine, that's our conjectural diagram of his machine, is totally different. The store is a couple of cylinders holding shuttles. Each shuttle holds a set of rods, a set of 21 rods for a sign and 20 digits, 20 decimal digits. There was also a device which provided essentially a read-only memory of a table used for performing division. The way in which numbers were brought from the, just looking, no, I thought for a moment I had a convenient mouse here. Can I see it? Yeah. The memory, access to the memory involved rotating either the inner or the outer cylinder, and then having the chosen shuttles move along these so-called races into the index where the multiplication would be done, and then the result of that multiplication completed by adding the various two-digit partial products together in the mill, the arithmetic unit. That slide is a rather disreputable collection of wordings, some of which are modern, some of which are Ludgate's, but at least we identify which are which on the right there. Put them side by side and you see the incredible difference. Ludgate's machine was intended to be about that size. Compare it to Babbage. Let's go back to Ludgate's tables, okay? But this time, I'll use the example of multiplying 8 by 9. The reason for doing that is because the example given in Ludgate's paper is of, which he describes, okay, is that of multiplying 8,132 by 9,247. So I want to show you the start of this, the multiplying of the 8 by the 9, okay? 8 and 9 have index numbers, 3 and 14. Add those together, you get 17. Look up 17 in the second table, and you get the value 72. Okay, so that's, oh, drat. Sorry, there's a phone. I'll turn this off. No. Sorry.
It's this one. It's this one. I've got it here.
No. Press it.
What? That's it.
Right.
Sorry
about that. I've taken various precautions against being interrupted, but hadn't thought of disconnecting the phone.
I did.
Somebody is very anxious to reach me, but they'll have to wait a bit. Okay. The heart of the multiplication device is the mechanical representation of the single-digit index numbers. The set of decimal numbers is shown here, not in decimal order, the 1, 2, 4, 8, 3, 6, and so on. In other words, they're shown here in the descending order of the amount of extrusion from the shuttle box, and that represents the simple index. That sort of rod is used here to represent the number 8. That's that amount of extrusion, and to govern the extent to which this slide can move upwards. It will be halted when it gets to the appropriate notch, if you like. And so that sequence of notches is used to represent the ordinal numbers. And so by pushing that slide upwards, and in fact, the shuttle downwards, what you find is the amount of overlap between these two devices. I'll show it on the next slide, because you have the multiplicand slide and the multiplier side, and the amount of overlap you get is in fact representing the result. And somehow, by means we do not know and can't really guess, that amount of overlap enables you to find the compound index, the two-digit results of the multiplication. So that shows you the multiplicand digit of 8, the multiplier 9, and that length there is representing the result of multiplying 8 by 9. That is the heart of the multiplier, we believe. We didn't have any drawings like that, so we went searching for them, and the search was immense. I list some of the places we went looking for them, and we had quite a publicity campaign, and the publicity campaign worked. Ralph Bülow of the Nixdorf Museum found a very little-known magazine contained an article, an anonymous article, describing Ludgate's work. published just a few months after Ludgate's paper. And it turned out that that article was a somewhat shortened version of one from an equally obscure journal in those days called Engineering. And each of those papers included a drawing, a rather abstract drawing representing the index. And it's absolutely clear to us that this drawing must surely have been provided by Ludgate himself. With all of the extra information in these papers, and particularly the drawing, we've been able to make much more detailed conjectures concerning how the index worked. The drawing, as I say, is pretty abstract. That is a copy of it with, in red, our annotations explaining it, and the description on the right is the text which goes alongside that. And you have to look very carefully at that drawing. It is looking at it's a sort of an edge-on view. Oops. It's an edge-on view of that picture, but with the slides vertical rather than horizontal. I hope that helps a bit. Certainly, there's much too much detail to explain there than is appropriate to try and include in this talk, given the other things I want to say. So, this is our conjectural, very much a conjectural drawing of how the frames containing these slides were organized and brought together, and how the races along which numbers traveled in order to be brought into the this multiplication device would have worked. That drawing needs, you have to study that very carefully to see what numbers are actually being represented in it. And here's another conjectural drawing about how the memory and the races allowed the bringing of operands into the multiplication device in order that that could be performed. Say the drawing does, in fact, try to represent the exact numbers that are portrayed in the in what we believe is the actual Ludgate drawing. So, using this extra information and doing an awful lot of thinking about what Ludgate exactly said, we believe we've added really quite a lot to our understanding of Ludgate's machine. Certainly much more than you'll find in my 1971 paper. That the base operation is MAC, multiply, accumulate, not addition. That numbers must be fixed, well, a fixed point. Oh, I won't read all of those, but I have put asterisks by those inferences that we've made from our study, which we've documented in excruciating detail in reports that you can find online now. That his instruction set must have been at least add, subtract, multiply, divide, store, and conditional branch. It was load and store was 2 operands. That add and subtract would take 3 seconds, multiply 10 seconds, etc. We believe that the storage of 192 variables indicates very strongly that he had a 64 register and 128 register cylinder, and that he must have been using sort of binary representation for his addressing. That's a conjecture, but I'd certainly stand by it. The size, the exact size that he gives, you see down there as well. So you'd be amazed at the amount of work, particularly my colleagues, rather than I, have put into producing what lies behind that slide. For all that, there are still an awful lot of questions which we've not been able to answer. We have got no idea how the storage cylinders were rotated, how the shuttle was really moved along a race, how the mill mechanism for doing the additions of the partial products, how that worked, we just don't know. We would assume, though, that by 1909 there was enough in the way of commercially available addition machines, calculating machines, that Ludgate would have had a pretty good starting point for that part of his work. And we know little or nothing about how the program control worked in input and output. And despite all the searching, all the other drawings still remain to be found. And if you like, that's where we've got to on Ludgate's machine. We've also put a considerable amount of effort into trying to find out more about his ancestry and his early life. We now know his ancestry back to the mid-1700s. We found that his father was in the militia. He was a sergeant musketry instructor, probably doing quite a lot of paperwork as well, from what we've been able to learn about that role. We have managed to identify a lot of relatives, but nobody, almost nobody, still alive. Certainly, we were hoping to find descendants of the later generations. We found out what school he went to, and that at the age of 15, he got a temporary, a 5-year post in the Irish Civil Service. In 1903, he was the top Irish candidate in the civil service examinations for the assistant clerkship. For some strange reason, he did not get appointed, and 6 people below him did, though there might have been a medical reason for this. The next year, he passed the next level up of examination and failed the medical examination. Most intriguingly, his case was raised in the House of Commons by somebody who was not his MP. You can imagine how hard we've looked, how hard we tried to find out why. Who was Timothy Harrington? How could he possibly link to Ludgate, etc.? We've got nowhere there. We already knew that he was working for a corn merchant, that he was some sort of commercial clerk. But we found that shortly after, 2 or 3 years after his second paper, he had passed his first his intermediate accountancy exams and then his finals in 1917. Quite when he became employed as an accountant, we don't know. So the standard descriptions of Ludgate as an accountant who invented an early computer almost certainly are wrong. That it was that work was done after he became a member of the accountancy profession. His birthplace. He was born in Skibbereen right down in the south of Ireland there in County Cork. They are really rather proud of him now. And one of the manifestations of that is that a rather impressive, how shall I call it, organization for assisting and educating in the use of computers has been set up. It's named after him, the Ludgate Hub. His relatives, details are given of them there, but we had not managed to find any living descendants of those several families in various parts of Ireland. That is the family tree that we had constructed. And you see that Percy is the youngest son of Michael Ludgate and Mary McMahon, and that we've traced him back to a Matthew Ludgate, a farmer, whose children were born in the 1730s and 40s and 50s. We haven't managed to find anybody else on that family tree, but you'll find that we got a little bit further. That's where he lived from 1899 to 1922, and in Drumcondra, which is essentially in Dublin. That's where he did his work. Kevin's and Son was a very prominent accountants in Dublin. They still exist, so to speak, as one of the originators of a still big extant accountancy firm. And Ludgate died in 1922, aged 39, having worked there for a number of years. He was living on Dargle Road. He was working on Dame Street, drawing this little picture, or rather having Google draw it for me. I think is really rather charming. The notion that somebody who designed such an early mechanical computer could have his very likely road to work drawn out by a computer that he could have been carrying in his pocket now, just shows you how far we've come. What's interesting about that route, though, is that or really any plausible variant of it, is that he must have seen the impact of the Easter Uprising in Ireland in 1916 and the huge amount of destruction that were there, that resulted, because a lot of that lasted for years. And there's one example. That's one of the streets he would have walked down for years during the last decade of his life. 2 or 3 years later, he is surely bound to have seen this giant peace parade, some of which passed right in front of his place of work after the end of World War I. But 1918 was tragic in Dublin, not just because of the people who, the soldiers who died, but also the Spanish flu. More Irishmen died in the Spanish flu pandemic than as a result of World War I. And surely these events must have had a major impact on him. And indeed, it seems rather plausible, at any rate, that his own death was not disconnected to the Spanish flu. But we made one more discovery. We did in fact find a whole set of relatives. When we were searching, doing the standard genealogical research about Ludgate, we found that there was somebody else was looking for Violet Ludgate. She was my only source of family information, and by 1987, 16 years later, there were no other descendants of his parents that were still extant. The Ludgate grave lay unmarked, but we found that somebody else had been looking for him, for her. That she, though we knew she'd never married, had in fact had a descendant. She'd given birth to a daughter in 1935 who was immediately adopted, renamed, and brought up overseas. And the descendants of that person, Anita, who still alive, joined in our search, and being a genealogist, contributed greatly to it. Perhaps more interestingly is the fact that, having found a set of grandchildren of Violet, we managed to, or rather they managed to get the necessary permissions so that Ludgate's unmarked grave could at last have a suitable headstone. And you might say that in a certain sense, that was our second result. Our first result was a drawing that nobody knew existed. Our second result is a new headstone on which you find Percy Edward Ludgate, 2nd of August 1883 to 16th October 1922, analytical machine pioneer. That ends my story, but I'll hopefully, I don't know what's. I'm trying to get one further slide, and for some unknown reason I can't. But the my one further slide just makes reference to a quote from the golfer Arnold Palmer, which is a lovely quote, but applying it to research, which was what he said was, "The more I practice, the luckier I get," and the amount of practice, the amount of effort done by my colleagues in this project is an indication that perhaps we deserved our luck. Thank you.
Brian, thank you for that fascinating story. And there are a number of people who have popped questions into the chat facility. I wonder whether, sorry. Yes, I wonder whether Adrian Cornforth would like to ask his question about reliability. If he'd like to unmute.
Yeah, I can do that for you. Thank you for the talk, Brian. My question was, you describe a compact, complex system that was proposed, and did the team have any thoughts on the likely reliability of it? Because Babbage, for example, provisioned a mechanism to shake his cogs and for halting on errors, etc.?
Well, we've got so little information on it that the most obvious sort of conclusions that we can draw are from the fact that Babbage, many years earlier, as demonstrated later by the Science Museum, had designed a machine which really was reliable, though just built with the techniques and the precisions of the, was it 1860s? I can't remember now. So this is a long time later than that. By the first decade of, well, by 1909, shall I say, there really were quite successful calculating machines available commercially, including some that included built-in decimal multiplication, like the Millionaire machine. And certainly there were adding machines, so that as to whether Ludgate himself had the skill to build a reliable piece of machinery of that complexity, who knows? But it seemed to us that certainly the world now had that skill.
Okay, thank you.
Beg your pardon, I didn't press the correct button. Now, David Link, an old friend of CCS. David, you have a question about Ludgate and Babbage. Would you like to unmute rather, and ask your question?
Yes, thank you for the wonderful talk. My question was very simple. My impression was that Ludgate names his machine an analytical engine. But isn't it true that Ludgate's analytical engine is more similar to Babbage's difference engine than to his analytical engine, as far as we can judge from the limited information we have? Thank you.
That's an intriguing question. One of the reasons it's intriguing is that we know that after working on his analytical machine, Ludgate claims, I think in a single sentence, to have worked on a difference engine. Okay, but I'm not sure why you would say that Ludgate's machine was more similar to Babbage's difference engine than his analytical machine.
I'm not sure if it was possible, for example, to feed in, it was possible to feed in variables and operators into the machine, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It was possible.
It was both Babbage planned with respect to the analytical machine and drew detailed designs for a complete difference engine, which was subsequently built at the Science Museum.
Yes.
For a machine which actually could yes, I come to think of it, I can't remember. For the moment, I've gone a bit blank about punch cards and difference engines. I think the intriguing thing is that Ludgate himself was planning, or claimed he had also designed a difference engine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Brian, have you given thought, or has the team given thought to building even a small part of the machine? You were showing your thoughts and also the surviving, or the diagram that reappeared thanks to Heinz Nixdorf Forum in Paderborn. Have you given thought to building a small part to see how well it works?
You bet.
So you're looking for a wealthy sponsor, are you, to pay for some machining?
Brian Coughlin is the leader on that. Those drawings are from him. He certainly, I think, is the route I see him going down is that of CAD to 3D printing.
Technology is wonderful. There's an interesting little comment come in, Brian, from Jim Hancock, who worked with a man called Eric Ludgate, who was a mechanical engineer in the magnetic tape department of ICL at Kidsgrove. Ludgate's an unusual name, so whether this is a distant relative, we don't know. I don't know. I don't know whether Jim Hancock wants to add anything to that. Sorry, I was muted. Jim.
Am I muted still?
No, you're now, we hear you loud and clear now.
Okay. Well, yes, I joined the tape department in 1973. And there was probably 60% electrical, electronic engineers, 40% mechanical engineers. And Eric was one of the group of mechanical engineers, and I worked with him for several years. Interesting character, as most of them were. That's probably all I can say about it.
He never talked about a cousin or a great uncle.
I'm afraid not.
It's not a name we've come across, but if you'd like to jot down anything you know about him and let us have an email, that would be. I tell you, we have searched down incredibly unlikely and obscure places, almost always to no avail.
I wonder if Fujitsu Services personnel people have got any extant records of him. Be interesting. I'll try and find out.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Out.
Thank you. We've got a question from Dan Hayton in the London meeting room. Where you go, Dan?
Yes, I hope this is working. I'm not sure it is. Yes, the button is showing red, so I'm assuming I'm alive and people can hear me. I was interested to see the note in Ludgate's paper with a reference to Léon Bollé, who was really a sort of general engineer in Le Mans in France. He built motor cars, he built ducted vane wind engines, but he also, as we discovered in our visit to Munich, built a sort of millionaire calculator, of which there's an example in the museum. So it's interesting that there was obviously somebody with a wide interest in engineering who was also looking at these sorts of mechanical calculating devices at the same sort of time.
I think Bollé was the first, wasn't he, to do a multiplier? I did look into the history of calculating machines very considerably when I was putting together my book on the origins of digital computers. But that was quite a long time ago now. and I would want to go and refer to the index in my book before I'd really like to state for sure anything more about Bolle.
And another question in the room from, well, from next month's speaker, who I was about to give a plug for when we reach the close of the meeting. But Delwyn, ask your question and make the comment.
Thank you, Roger. It's okay. I will allow you to make the plug later. It was more of an observation, really, that the quoted operation times of 3 seconds for addition and 10 seconds for multiplication are actually slightly faster than what the Witch achieves. So they are indeed impressive for 1909.
There was enough in the way of commercially available machinery that I assume he felt that he could make and justify such estimates.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I understand it, the speed that the Witch operated at was comparable to somebody using a manual adding machine at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly what I've been led to believe. Someone well trained on that machine, I would add as well. So yeah, I guess those machines didn't evolve tremendously in terms of speed over that period.
Mm. Interesting. Thank you.
There is a comment from a well-known computer historian, Gerard Alberts. I wonder whether Gerard would like just to make a comment about the reference to Ludgate that he's drawn to our attention. Gerard Alberts, are you there? You left a comment. Okay. Let me just briefly then just read the comment. He references I.B. Cohen's biography of Howard Aitken and notes that on page 70, there is an indirect reference to Ludgate. Aitken, referring to predecessors Babbage, Bolle, Scheutz, and Ludgate, is clearly based on the reading of Baxendall of 1926. But it's good to have him with us, but sadly without sound. I think that's the last comment for today. Can I thank everybody for attending, combining the total with us here in London with those attending virtually. We had about 110 people in total on the call. I hope very much that you enjoyed the meeting. We are very grateful to Brian for being the first little piece of history for you, Brian. The Computer Conservation Society's speaker at the first hybrid meeting. As far as I can tell, it worked. If you have any comments or feedback, we would be interested, as long as it's not too abusive. Thank you very much for today. I guess we can all give Brian a wave. Those of you who are unmuted, you can clap as well. But
could I make just one quick comment?
Yes, of course, Brian.
Because for some reason I couldn't get to my last slide. You didn't see the set of acknowledgements, but I really want. There's quite a number of people whose help we and I want to acknowledge. You will find that in the copy of my slides that I made available and in the paper I referenced. And you will there also find a link to the huge amount of online information that Brian Coughlin makes available.
Brian, thank you once again for that, and your acknowledgement of your co-workers. I can confirm that it is October the 21st that we will be hearing Delwyn's talk at 2:30 at 2:30 London time, because I know we have quite a number of participants from outside the UK, but 14:30 London time on October the 21st. So I look forward to meeting you in person or virtually on that occasion. And thanks again to Brian for a great talk. Thanks very much indeed.
We the first question.